Hello and welcome to the Petticoated Swashbuckler. My name is Maren and today we're going Viking. Like I said in my last video, when I did the sort of review of the year, plans for the next year, one of the things that people seemed to really want more of was the Middle Ages. And I'm just happy to oblige because I love the medieval period. Now, if you're a little bit rusty on what the Middle Ages are, I'm going to give you a quick kind of, a very quick kind of going through. So the Middle Ages is usually the name used for that roughly 1,000-year period between the end of the Roman Empire in Europe, in Western Europe, and when it ends depends a little bit on who you ask. I know some people use 1492 when Christopher Columbus rediscovered America for Europeans. Some people use 1517, which is the year of the beginning of the Reformation of Martin Luther. Some people use 1543, which is the year when Nicholas Copernicus's book came out about how the world, the Earth rotates around the sun instead of the other way around. And it's also the year when Andreas Vesalius's book about the human anatomy came out, which was actually based on like real postmortems of real humans instead of dissections of monkeys and what some old Greek guy had said. So it depends a little bit, but usually from around like 500 to around 1500. That's usually what's called the medieval period in European history, especially Western European history. Now, of course, it's a massive period, 1,000 years. That's a very long time. And if people in the Middle Ages did not know that they were living in the Middle Ages, they didn't wake up one day and think, oh, I feel like we're medieval now. The Middle Ages was a name given to it by the Renaissance, the period that came after it, because it's the period between, in the middle of, the Antiquity, when people were, knew stuff and invented stuff and had philosophy and stuff, and the Renaissance, which is kind of the rebirth of that period. And Renaissance people were quite scathing about the people living in that kind of dark period for those thousands of years. Because it's such a massive chunk of time, we tend to divide it into three chunks. It's the early Middle Ages, from the 500, 600 to about year 1000. And then it's the High Middle Ages, which is from about year 1000 to about the middle of the 1300s. And then the Late Middle Ages, from the middle of the 1300s to approximately 1500. And today we're going to be focusing on the early Middle Ages. So that first chunk. Now, to talk about the early Middle Ages, we really also need to talk about the Antiquity, the period that came before it. The parts of Europe that have been ruled by the Romans really struggled to keep going once the Romans pulled back into Italy, and the Roman Empire was divided between East and West, and the Western Empire kind of collapsed, and everyone who lived where the Romans had ruled for several hundred years really struggled. The people who knew how to run a bureaucracy had moved back to Italy. The people who knew how to build in stone had left. The people who knew how to make plumbing had left. And perhaps the most kind of important thing was that the Roman Empire had a violence monopoly. So, for example, in Britain, people had been great warriors, great fighters. The Celts were known for their ferocity in war, in battle. But when the Romans came, people weren't allowed to be warriors unless they were Roman warriors. And a Celtic person who would sign up to be a Roman soldier would not be allowed to serve in the Roman army in Britain. They would have been sent across the continent to Egypt or to what's today Turkey, or they would to make sure people didn't revolt against them. So after the Romans left, there was a lot of movement of people, strong leaders who realized that the land over there is kind of for the taking. Yeah, people are living on it, but they do not know how to fight. So there was a lot of movement of people. You had what's usually called the Anglo-Saxons, people from like northern Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands and Belgium, who moved over to Britain. The Umayyads in Spain from 711, and you had, where people didn't move around, you had people who kind of tried to consolidate and create their own little Roman empires, like Charlemagne in France. And throughout Europe, you had the Vikings, Scandinavians who would sail around in their ships and affect history. So I'm sure that you have in your head a very strong idea of what a Viking is. Maybe like a big, hairy, muscle dude with like a big axe and like fur on his shoulders. There's still a lot of debate about the Vikings and whether or not they were as violent as they usually kind of portrayed as. On one hand, their society was very violent. There were blood feuds, they had like duels to the death, to settle scores, and they raided and they pillaged and they fought a lot of battles, and they were known for being good fighters, and it was important to them to die in battle because that's the only way they could reach like their equivalent of heaven, Valhalla. You couldn't get to Valhalla if you died peacefully in your sleep, then you'd go to hell, Helheim. However, they also had a sort of, not democracy exactly, but they did have something called the Thing. And I know I'm not talking about that hand from Adam's family. The Thing was somewhere where you could take your conflicts. And it's more like a parliament. And the Thing would be in session at least once a year. And while the Vikings were pre-literate, they weren't illiterate, because that means you have the option of learning to read and write, and you either don't want to or don't have the opportunity. But they did not have, their writing was not meant for like writing down laws and stuff. So what instead they had was a guy whose job was to memorize all the laws. And then at every thing he would say all the laws out loud, and then people would use the laws that they just heard and try and decide in conflicts between people. So perhaps we can conclude sort of quickly that they were brutal, but they were not uncivilized, and maybe not more brutal than other people in the same time period, because it was a very brutal time period. Now, if you came to this video because you're proud to be better than anyone else, because a sketchy website told you that you have 26.57% Viking DNA, I'm here to disillusion you. Being a Viking is not an ethnicity. It's an occupation. And really, it's not a noun. We shouldn't talk about a Viking. We should use it as a verb. We should talk about going Viking. To Viking. Because it was an activity. It was considered that in the time period, as far as we can tell. Why Viking? What does the word mean? No one really knows. There's a lot of theories. But saying that all Scandinavians in the early Middle Ages were Vikings would be a little bit like saying that all Englishmen in the 1600s were pirates, because some of them were, you know? So instead of thinking of Viking as a group of people, an ethnicity, tied to like a land area and like a physicality almost, think of them as a job, as people who went pirating, who went a Viking. And they were pirates. They were raiders. The Norwegian Vikings went mostly to the British Isles. The Danish Vikings went to England, to Germany. Swedish Vikings went into Russia or Ukraine. And Vikings raided modern-day France. They went all the way down to the Mediterranean. They tried to sack Rome. They didn't. They found a small city called Luna, and they thought that was Rome because they didn't really know what a big city was. And then they sacked that, and they were really happy having sacked what they thought was Rome and went back home. Like, they traveled a lot. They were even the personal guards of the emperor of Miklagard, who, that's the Viking word for Constantinople, what's today Istanbul. And I love that because Miklagard, Mikla means big, and gard means fence. So the first Viking to arrive at Constantinople looked at that big city wall and were like, whoa, that's a big fence, dude, which I love. Some Viking leaders, perhaps we should call them pirate captains, found blackmail more effective than straight out like piracy. So in the British Isles you have something called Danegeld, especially in England you have Danegeld, which is basically, if you pay us a lot of money, we promise we won't come and raid you. And then after a couple of years we're like, well, now you have to pay us more money to not come and raid you. And the English kings paid up. In France, the kings chose to give them land instead, to be like, you can live here on the coast. You can call it the land of the Normans. Normandy, for example. And the people, the Vikings who settled in other places than Scandinavia were very quick to adopt the cultures where they arrived. And that's one of the reasons why I get so annoyed when people believe that the Viking culture was somehow superior to all other cultures. Because the Vikings certainly did not think so. Vikings in England married locals. They converted to Christianity. They set up as traders and farmers. In York, in the north of England, the Vikings, that's the old Viking capital of northern England. There are so many streets named after Viking craftsmen, not Viking warriors, Viking craftsmen, like Copgate, the street where you make cups, or Skeldegate, the street where you make shields. And the Vikings who settled in Normandy, they became very Frenchified very quickly. They changed the dialects and the language, they changed their culture and their religions. So Viking culture was definitely not seen as something incredible and unchangeable by the Vikings themselves. Some elements, however, were specific to the Vikings, making it possible to tell when an item from a grave, for example, is Viking or not. Is it Scandinavian? And the most common ones are these. So these brooches, they're sometimes called shield brooches. They're sometimes called like a tortoise brooch. I don't think the Vikings ever saw like a tortoise, especially not while still living in Scandinavia. So I don't know. It's a funny name, but I like tortoise brooches. And these were used to wear a specific kind of dress, the kind that's hanging behind me. And this is sometimes called an apron dress because it looks a little bit like an apron with like the straps and some fabric. It's sometimes called a strap dress because of the straps. I've also seen it called a hengerrock, which rock means dress and henge means hanging, so a hanging dress, or a trägrock. But I think I'll be using the word smokkr, as that's the word that seems to be used in Scandinavian saga literature, so we'll use it as smokkr. And these shield brooches were used to hold these straps together. Smart, isn't it? What do we know about what Vikings wore? Well, I'll tell you at once, not enough. Not enough for me to make an outfit for every century of the Viking Age or the early Middle Ages in Scandinavia. Our sources are very scant. I found this amazing article by Hilde Tunem, who's a Norwegian scientist, and she's gathered a lot of the information, the archaeological information and the saga literature about Viking women's dress and the various interpretations of the finds that we have. And I will link it down below because I could not have done this project without her and her article. She's brilliant. Our sources for Viking clothing are mainly archaeological, but we do have some art pieces and a few literary sources. And then we have some fragments of clothing from graves, along with some like scraps of clothing that were used to waterproof ships. So long after the dresses were kind of done with their life as clothing, they were kind of ripped apart, cut apart, and stuffed in between the planks of ships' hulls to keep them waterproof. The Vikings had not invented polyester. It was all natural fibres, linen and wool, and a little bit of silk. So their clothes tend to decompose, and especially if it's been next to a decomposing body, tends to be very little left. The little that we do have is usually what has been protected by these brooches. So if that's where the brooch has been, you kind of cut around it. What's underneath it, that's what we have to work with. So not a lot. Linen degrades a lot quicker than wool, so we have almost no linen left and very, very little wool. The exception are these straps. They're often linen, and they have survived because they've been protected by the metal. I don't think we have any fragments that we can definitely say are from the hem of the garment. It's mostly up here. So we do not know exactly what shape they had. We do not know exactly how long they were. That's impossible from archaeological sources. There are some carvings and tapestries and figurines depicting women from Viking Age Scandinavia, and they're a little different from Norway to Sweden to Gotland to Denmark, but they can still be useful, and they often show women from the side, so they give a cue to the length of the garments and also like the combination of garments. And they all of these women on these figurines seem to be wearing floor-length dresses. Sometimes they even have a bit of a train. It's very difficult to know if it's their smokkr that's long or the shift or the sark underneath. The figurines also show some headwear and accessories, for example, the brooches. And there is a carving of a woman in a smokkr from Pighill in England, and that smokkr seems to be very short. So probably, we don't know, might have been artistic choice, might have been that women in England wore shorter smokkrs than women in Gotland, for example. The literary sources are not very useful, except from the saga Rigstula. That's the only one I found that mentions what a woman is dressed like. If you find any other, let me know. They describe her as wearing a smokkr on her head, which I'm guessing is some sort of veil or head covering, a smokkr on her chest, so a cloth at her neck, and dwarves on her shoulders, which no one knows what a dwarf is. It might have been another kind of brooch. That's really the only kind of description, because the sagas tend to be more interested in what men are wearing than the women, which is an interesting contrast till today when it's women's clothing that we kind of analyse the heck out of in celebrity magazines and TV shows, not men's. Now, Tunnum warns against creating what she calls a Frankensmokkr, which is like taking lots of elements from lots of different archaeological finds from all over the place and then kind of mishmashing those together into one smokkr. There is evidence of some difference between like different geographical locations. There was probably some change across time. The graves that I've used stretch from the 8th to the 10th century. There is probably changes throughout that period. It's likely that an 8th century smokkr from Denmark would look different from a 10th century smokkr from Ireland or Norway. Another problem is that there are so few finds and so many interpretations. One of the interpretations is like a late style peplos. A peplos, if you don't know, is what people wore in the Antiquity period before the early Middle Ages, where you would wear a dress made from one big piece of fabric and it would be just pinned like to the shoulders. So all of the interpretations, they stretch from a kind of late period peplos to clothes inspired by 17th century Russian dress. Most believe that the brooches were worn on the chest. Some believe that's a very prudish modern interpretation and that they should be worn Madonna style. I'm not sure. You know, I feel very Wagnerian wearing them like this. Some people believe that the dress was open at the sides, some people believe that it was open in the front, some people believe that it was a continuous tube around the body. It's very difficult to know. So with that in mind, it's hard to know how they changed over time, it's hard to know how they changed geographically, and it's hard to know which interpretation to go with. I ended up making not one Viking dress, but 3. It sounds like a lot, but it's actually, I'm limiting myself to 3. That way we can look at different time periods, and we can look at different places and different interpretations, and experiment a bit and see what works. So let's see. So the first dress I made is what I call my Birka smokkr. Birka was a very important trading centre in Viking Age Sweden, and had lots of contacts towards the east, so Russia and Ukraine, and the Eastern Roman Empire for that matter, and even further. And a lot of the graves have been excavated in Birka, and they date from the 9th and 10th centuries. My Birka smokkr will be based on the interpretations of Flemming Bau, who was an artist and scholar who worked with the Birka finds in the 1980s. He argued, based on the extant fragments and also on the figurines that I showed you a moment ago, that the smokkr could be open in the front. To show off fancy dresses and tunics underneath, because we have a lot of very highly trimmed and decorated tunics from Birka. The smokkrs from Birka are often trimmed with silk, probably imported from the east, and sometimes just amazing Persian silk brocades that have been cut into strips and applied over the tops of the dresses. I'm wearing my Birka smock with a red wool dress, and I'm also adding a green train, like the one you can see in some of the figurines, and a blue apron. And I'm holding it together in the front with one of those trefoil brooches that we find in a lot of graves. And in the graves, they are usually placed approximately kind of in the middle of the torso of the woman. So it's not impossible that it was worn like this. My second dress is what I call my Køstrup smokkr. Køstrup is on Fyn in Denmark, and it was a quite a small graveyard that was found there. It was also found in the 1980s, and it includes a mid-9th century grave with fragments of fabric. And the smokkr in that grave is interesting because it includes a small gathered area, most likely in the front between the brooches. We have some gathered fragments from Norway as well, so this might have been more common than it appears from the archaeological evidence. But it's still an interesting element that I want to try and recreate. The smokkr is trimmed with a tablet woven band, which is also quite common in the source material, but here the band is not stitched to the dress, but it's rather suspended between the brooches. And I'm wearing this dress with a blue linen smock or smokkr or shift. And that's because the only colour we have found evidence of in linen fabrics from the early Middle Ages in Scandinavia is blue. All other colours tend to wear out. If you dye linen with madder, or you dye them with any other colour, plant colour, they tend to fade really, really quickly, but woad kind of sticks a lot better. So that's why this shift is blue. And the third dress is probably the most frank and smokkery of my dresses, because I'm using finds from Hedeby or Hedeby in Germany and from Køstrup in Norway. The Hedeby smokkr is not from a grave, which is cool. It was dipped in tar at some point and used to waterproof the ship. And it's probably 10th century, and it shows a couple of different methods for shaping the garment, which is interesting. There's a shaped seam, you know, to shape it to the body, and it's also a dart. I was so surprised by this. I use a lot of darts in 19th and 20th century sewing, but then the bulk of the dart is always on the inside of the garment. Here, it is meant to be seen. It's on the outside of the garment, and it's trimmed with a braided cord. There's also evidence of the cord used to cover the seams of the garments as well. The reason why I'm combining this with finds from Køstrup, although those finds are like a century older and in a different country, is that cord. Because the finds from Køstrup show the same use of cord. At least one smokkr in Køstrup had cords along either the top of or the lower hem, meaning this is something that was used in more than one place and in more than one time. So the Køstrup find shows use of tablet woven braid. I used some of that on my smock. I'm wearing it with my undyed linen shift and also a small silk apron. And this silk apron is trimmed with tablet woven bands that are, as close as I could get them, copies of the tablet woven bands from Oseberg, which is the most famous Norwegian Viking ship burial find. It's included the body of what we sometimes call the Oseberg Queen, and she had this tablet woven band on her things in that ship. We have very little evidence of embroidery from the Viking period, but I made this many years ago before I really started researching this, just based on what I saw other people wear and do. So I just kept it there because I think it's pretty. So these are my 3 Viking dresses and also my pepless dress. It's been really interesting trying to understand Viking clothing a bit more. I highly recommend that article because she goes into so much more detail than I can do in a video. So really check that out if you're interested in Vikings and Viking age dress. And just remember that we have so much interpretation, so little evidence, that if someone comes up to you and like berates you for your Viking dress being wrong, you can tell them that we can't know that. They can't know that. It's all interpretation and very little secure knowledge. And also, if you're wearing Viking menswear and someone comes up to you and they say that it looks wrong, that's even better, because we have, apart from the kind of Eastern Vikings in Russia and Ukraine, we have like no evidence for trousers in Viking men. As far as we know, they were going full Donald Duck style, wearing only tunics. So, you know, have fun with it. And I had fun with it. I am now going to swoosh around in my Viking dresses, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks with the next century. Until then, bye!